Cross Red Crescent Climate Red Summit. So I've certainly heard some amazing and inspiring talks already today, and I'm looking forward to the discussions that we'll have and the presentations that we'll have over the next 90 minutes. My name is Doug Cuby, and I'm a volunteer member of the Irish Red Cross International Advisory Group, and also a former Irish Red Cross staff member. I moved from humanitarian practice into academia about 10 years ago, and I currently work in the School of Law in University College Cork here in Ireland. I'm very pleased to be able to chair this panel discussion as part of this groundbreaking global virtual summit. I think we've all been part of many web and Zoom meetings in the past 6 months, but I think the scale and the ambition of this Red Cross Red Crescent Summit is, I think, amazing, and very, very glad that we can be part of this. This panel is entitled Using Law and Policy to Reduce Risk, Enhance Coherence and Protect People. And this has been organised by our colleagues in the IFRC Disaster Law Programme. And I'd like to thank all the colleagues in the Disaster Law Programme for their support and also for the work that they've done over many years to promote the improvement of disaster law. So what is the issue that we want to examine in this particular session? We have 90 minutes, so we want to be looking at the integration of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction, because integrating the policies, the activities in these two sectors is complex. We know that from practice and from theory. And so careful consideration is required to effectively address both the individual and the societal vulnerabilities to climate change and to disaster risk within domestic institutional arrangements and within regulatory frameworks. So the objective of this panel is to hear from experts from a range of different countries who will be providing practical examples of how law and policy can be used to, as the title says, reduce risk, enhance coherence, and to protect people. And ultimately that is the goal. That's what we're working towards, is the protection of people so that the risks that they face from both climate change and from disasters is minimized. We very much look forward to your own experiences and your own input in the interactive dialogue session and part of this session. Before I introduce our panel members, there are a few housekeeping points I'd like to make. First of all, this panel session is being recorded, and the IFRC will only use this recording for internal purposes. However, if the IFRC does want to share any part of this publicly, they will be asking your permission to do so. The contact details of the Disaster Law Programme will be in the final slide of this session. And you can also use those contact details because our objective or our plan is to develop a report from this panel, a written report, to summarise some of the key points that are raised. So you will have the contact details of the relevant people in the Federation Disaster Law Unit at the end of this session. I'm seeing some questions coming in the chat in relation to French and the translation into French. Unfortunately, I murder a beautiful language when I try to speak French. So I will stay in English, but I hope that the translation will be sorted for those of you who are joining us for other languages. I see each of our presenters are going to speak for around 7 minutes, and there will be an opportunity for you to ask some brief points of clarification at the end of each of their presentations. However, I'd ask you to keep any of your big questions you have until the question and answer session that we'll have at the end of the presentations. So we have 5 presenters, so we'll have around an hour of presentations, and then about 25 minutes for question and answers at the end. And we're very keen to hear your thoughts, your inputs, and your experiences during that time. The panel will then close with, I think, the global premiere of the new IFRC disaster law video, which I have seen a preview of and looks magnificent. So if you're able to stay for the final 2.5 minutes to watch that video, I think you'll be very rewarded. And finally, many of you already have access to the chat function. The chat function will be monitored by colleagues in the Federation. And so therefore, I'd ask if you have any particular questions, if you can pose them in the chat function. So now I'm honoured to be able to introduce our distinguished panel members. First of all, we have Nola Patelo Faso, who's the Acting International Legal Advisor for the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Next, we have Sandra Carter-Rowe, the Director General of the Dominica Red Cross Society. Suzanne Steiner, Advisor for the Division of Governance and Conflict in GIZ in Germany. Next, we have Diana Mosquera, the Program Management Officer of the Sendai Monitoring, who's based in the Office of the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Office for Africa. Next, we have Tommaso Natoli, who's a research fellow seconded to the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent Disaster Law Programme from University College Cork. And we will then have an input from the floor from Orsola Lusognoli, who's the Senior Policy Officer in Disaster Management in the Peace and Security Unit in the German Federal Institute of Economic Development and Cooperation. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing their thoughts on how we can integrate and how we can improve the coherence and protection between the two frameworks of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. So our final panel speaker is Dr. Tommaso Natoli. And Tommaso is an Irish Research Council and Marie Curie Research Fellow based here in the School of Law, UCC. So for transparency purposes, I should mention that Tommaso is one of my direct colleagues here in UCC. Tommaso has been seconded to the Disaster Law Programme of the IFRC in Geneva for the past year as part of his research project, which is funded by the Irish Research Council and the European Union. And so his research is analysing the integration of these three frameworks we've been talking about, the Sendai framework, the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. So I'll hand over to Tommaso to explain more about the research that he's been conducting for the past 12 months or so. Tommaso.
Thank you, Doug, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. First, let me thank again Isabelle Granger and the whole Disaster Law team for organizing this very interesting and participated event. And also a special thanks goes to Emmanuel Boscardin from the IFRC Policy and Diplomacy Unit, who is providing a great technical support to this event, acting behind the scenes. I will take 1 minute to briefly present my ongoing research project, which, as you said, is co-funded by the Irish Research Council under the EU Horizon 2020 program, and the German government is also providing financial support to the IFRC for its completion. In a nutshell, the project aims to support legal and policy reform processes for national authorities, adopting comprehensive and cross-sectoral measures on climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction. And in order to do that, I'm currently analyzing 3 national contexts from different geographic areas among the most exposed to climate-related disasters, namely Pacific Island countries, the Philippines, and the third will be Dominica starting from next October. The main purposes of the empirical research are to identify gaps and obstacles towards coherence and integration, as well as to trace out good normative practice and regulatory models to disseminate. One key component of my study is also the consideration and inclusion of vulnerable groups in law and policy making processes. One of the final outputs will consist in the publication of a global report containing a list of key recommendations that will be used for the development of advocacy tools supporting the work of the IFRC Disaster Law Program. So, in light of the considerations and the experiences brilliantly highlighted by previous panelists, I think we all agree on the assumption that coherent and sustainable CCA DRR regulatory settings largely depends on the adoption of integrated normative tools. My research and the interviews I conducted in the first 2 countries confirmed that these climate smart tools would enable enhanced coordination, better communication and information sharing between all stakeholders, public and private, reduce duplications, and therefore optimize available technical and financial resources, so improving the overall effectiveness of a risk governance system. Next slide, please, Emmanuel. Thank you. To give you a concrete idea of some of the empirical findings that emerged in the course of my research, I will briefly share 3 examples of good practice that I collected from both the Pacific and the Philippines. First, as also mentioned by Ms. Petello-Faso in her presentation, one first interesting aspect is about the sharing of good legislative practice among countries, especially, but not necessarily, from the same region. As an example, the Fijian Disaster Risk Management Bill has been partially inspired by work previously undertaken in Vanuatu, as well as by processes led by Nauru government with the support of regional organization and the IFRC. So this sort of peer learning can bring to more aligned frameworks in light of the similar features and challenges faced by neighboring countries, and thereby favoring the coherent fulfillment of the global framework that previous panelists mentioned. The second one, another noteworthy practice I recorded in the Pacific, is the inclusion in the text of a policy instrument. And in this case, you see the Kiribati Joint Implementation Plan for Climate Change and Disaster Risk Management. So the inclusion of an action matrix listing the procedural steps to follow for its implementation, also in relation to other sectoral policies and regulations. So identifying the roles of different governmental agencies and bodies and creating specific indicators to evaluate their performance over time. Thirdly, in the Philippines, both the main pieces of legislation for the 2 sectors, namely the Climate Change Act and Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act, explicitly regulate the involvement of governmental budget holders as part of the governance system that they built. And this is critical to ensure their concrete and combined actualization, but it's also important to ensure that resource allocation reaches local government units, the so-called frontline agencies in the Philippine system. And unfortunately, some issues have been reported in the Philippines on this point. Next slide, please, Emmanuel, thank you. To conclude, and also hopefully to feed into the following Q&A session, I think that it could be interesting to briefly mention some of the key recommendations for law and policy improvements coming from my research findings. Due to time limits, it won't be possible to mention more than 3 of them, but you can find all the documents on the project website. The first concern more technical formal aspect of lawmaking. And in particular, CCA and or DRR related legislation should carefully regulate the adoption of the so-called secondary legislation, for instance, regulations and other ministerial acts, which most of the time comprises enforcement measures and is instrumental for the concrete and integrated implementation in different sectors of the general direction and the overall objectives stated in the primary law. The second concerns the material content of law and policies and is about the fact that CCA and or DRR related legislation should regulate and ensure sufficient resources for the functioning of and access to information management systems and platforms, including, for instance, the so-called integrated risk scenarios. And to this end, technical barriers need to be identified and removed, and data needs to be generated in a way that consent their usability at all levels of government and across all sectoral administrations. To conclude, shifting to the focus to the protection of the most vulnerable, one key recommendation is to mandate through explicit provision an effective and transparent participation of those organizations representing vulnerable categories and specific vulnerable categories in a bill drafting process or in the review of existing laws. This should provide a real possibility to inform decision-making as well as inform the final text of laws. On this point, law and policies on CCA and DRR should assign specific responsibilities to institutions and agencies that are entrusted with the responsibility of addressing the rights and needs of vulnerable groups with regards to climate-related disasters. I think my time is up and I will stop there, but of course I'm available for any requests or follow-up. Thank you, and Doug, over to you again.
Thank you very much, Tommaso. And as you may have seen in the chat box, Isabel has put the links to the sections of the Federation website where you're able to access, for example, the global literature review that Tommaso conducted, which provides an excellent overview of academic and practitioner discussion of the integration of climate change and disaster risk reduction, as well as in his country reports that he's producing. And the project is ongoing. There's more reports that will come out of this over the next 6 to 9 months. So thank you very much, Tommaso.
Thank you, Doug.